Okay, so you want to put your piece of pottery on a plate or something like that. Before we started on this pottery project, I asked you students to do a little bit of research on ceramics of different cultures. And so this is exactly what I did. I did some research. I first started with pottery that I'm very familiar with, which is from East Asia. I looked into Korean pottery and Chinese pottery, and I discovered very, very striking similarities. And the one comes actually from the other. The Korean potters were very much influenced by Chinese pottery techniques and even forms. So here is the Meibyung and the Meiping, and they were used for very similar purposes. Hold wine and also long plum blossom branches. So they were kind of used decoratively as well. In Korea and China, they used very hard clay, so their pieces were made of stoneware or porcelain. That was the technology that came out of China. They were able to make very, very delicate but very strong clay pieces that were vitreous, which means waterproof, so they could hold that wine and water. The pottery of India, I wanted to look at some pottery of India, and I discovered something very interesting there too. They used a lot of unglazed earthenware. There was some blue glazed pottery in Jaipur, but that was brought by the Turco-Persian peoples when they came into India. So other cultures can, of course, influence other cultures, which happened in Korea too. But there was a lot of unglazed pottery for the most part, lots of low fire earthenware, which is very different from porcelain in that it's a lot more porous. It is not waterproof, although they did have some water jugs, but usually with earthenware, the water just kind of seeps through eventually and dries out. I found beautiful vases from India that had these like cut out windows, these little holes. Therefore, this piece was purely for decorative reasons. Maybe there was some sort of incense or perfumes or things like that could have been stored if there were holes in it so you could smell them. I'm not quite sure what the use of that was, but it was very, very decorative, and there was some texture on the surface. Chinese and Korean pottery tended to be mostly smooth. So that didn't really work for me in terms of texture, although there are always exceptions and different artists that may have had texture. Then I looked into African pottery, and I discovered the most texture on the surface of African pottery. So I'm going to base my little pot off of this piece by the Igbo people. Now, I don't have to copy it exactly. That's not the point of this assignment. But it is to use one of the texturing techniques that you may have found interesting. So this texture here on this pot that looks like it's wearing drapery was created by some sort of a little wedge-shaped tool, or maybe the tip. I can maybe use the tip of a little kitchen knife, but actually I'd rather use something a little safer. So you have to kind of think of a tool, maybe a toothpick, that could create those little textures. And they also applied coils right to the surface to create a three-dimensional effect and texture. This one here that I was looking at almost was all anthropomorphic. It almost looked like a little person's face. And they also did these beautiful, they weren't necessarily vessels, but these beautiful busts, that means figure portrait heads that came out of Nigeria, were quite textural. and they were very, very lifelike, and just as lifelike as some of these Greek and Roman sculptures that I've seen in art history in art school. So that is definitely something to be noted. So please do some research into pottery and ceramics, and you will be surprised at what kind of very interesting things that you learn about that field in different cultures and what similarities and differences there are. So I'm taking my knife here and I'm cutting this little coil in half. Portion out my coils by cutting it in half and cutting it in half again. That way, I'm letting these dry and being careful not to add too much water. And maybe I will just make the coils a little bit bigger. All right, so what I did was I rolled a very large kind of cylinder of clay, and then I portioned it off into small, fairly equal chunks of salt dough. And then I am making my little coil base. The salt dough seems to be kind of expanding slightly, and it is sticking to itself just fine. I am using this little Lazy Susan that is actually used for baking, and it's for decorating cakes. It doesn't seem to be really spinning very well on this table, but I'm just using it like a plate. And then I'm going to stick the next layer on. So that's like 3 layers right there. And when I add another coil, I overlap by at least 1/2 inch. And try not to pull too hard on the coils because that will thin them out. And in order to stick the coils together, you could just take your hand, put it on the inside, and very, very gently push on the inside and the outside. Don't push too hard or you're going to thin the walls too much. And that will just open up your pot slightly. And also the pressure will stick the coils together to each other. So you can already see now it's starting to get bigger. So I call this the dog dish. Whenever you're starting out any kind of a vessel, you start out with the dog dish. And it's better than calling it an ashtray. Now I'm going to add another layer, overlap, and just slightly put it on the outside of the circle, but not too dramatically. Because this is so soft, you could actually put it right on top of the previous layer, and then we could just shape it with our hands by putting our thumb on the inside and our 4 fingers on the outside and just shaping it and angling the walls a little bit outward if you want. But don't do it too dramatically or the whole piece will collapse. Okay, and I'm grabbing another chunk using the heel of my hand to kind of get it to just roughly the correct diameter, and then use my fingers up here to get it to be a little thinner, and then laying my coils on, getting some height. think I need to at this time acknowledge the difference between clay and of course salt dough, that this is made out of flour and salt, whereas clay is a lot denser and it's made up of fine particles of silt, which is a little different from like the topsoil on the top of, you know, the dirt lawn you might have. I mean, for the lawn, if you dig under the grass, you have your topsoil and then you have more and more denser layers underneath. And clay just can't be taken from anywhere. Clay is actually mined in specific places under specific conditions. And you know, flour is definitely, and a little water and salt is definitely not the same as clay. But we are going to try to emulate the look, or copy the look of a clay piece with this material. And so we're going to try that. And then I'm going to take my final piece and rolling it out, and I'm actually going to slightly put it inboard because my piece is so soft that it's tending to kind of flop. So I'm just going to put it a little bit inboard so it doesn't open up too wide. And if there is a thin part of the wall, you could actually add a little blob to the inside of a coil. But when it dries, it does definitely dry rock hard. So I'm going to let this base set up for a couple hours and then return back to this.